All right, welcome everyone. This is the Policy Committee and it is November 24th at 6:04 p.m. and we are meeting via Zoom. And the first item on our agenda is approving our minutes from our October 27th meeting. Tim, have you had a chance to look at the minutes?
Yes.
Great. Do you want to make a motion with regard to the minutes?
Yes, move to approve the minutes.
All right, I will second the motion. And all those in favor of approving the minutes, and the minutes are unanimously approved. Excellent. With that, Aaron, do you want to take us through the agenda for tonight?
Sure. Hopefully we can, dive right in. So two things. One, just checking in on the kind of community engagement event planning and the update there. And so talk for that a little bit. And then we have three more, like the other three of the discipline policies to review that Jake has done an awesome job helping to shepherd through. So we'll look at those kind of for a similar round of feedback like we did last month.
Excellent. Sounds good. Let's dive right in.
Great. So just in terms of the community engagement, thus far, like big picture, we've continued engagement with Family Partnership Advisory Council, have put it out there. I've been sharing kind of the drafts and updates with school leaders, with our internal leadership team through our Friday footnote. I've had, extended and ask if anybody wanted to kind of like get together. And so I have a couple of people. So we'll kind of do something in December, which again kind of works on our timeline, given December transition around committee to kind of come back to this for kind of like our second read at the committee to kind of finalize and approve in the new year. But so that's going along well. The Portland Empowered engagement, they had to reschedule on me. So that's coming up in December. So, and then need to still kind of finalize my student leaders, the YEPs and so forth. But we'll get to that so that we'll have had kind of complementary things just around this in general. But the main one is just moving forward with the community engagement event we've been talking about. So I had a great planning call, or just kind of, initial call turned into planning call with Michelle Holt, who was the facilitator recommended. And I think I've said recommended by Andy, from the foundation through prior work that she did when she was with Great Schools Partnership, through community engagement work around New England. So Michelle Holtz from UNH, New Hampshire Listens, so has done a lot of this kind of facilitation and really resonated kind of when I talked with her about kind of the approach. So, she had a bunch, and I think as we talked about last time, some of this configuration of like, how do you do this in meaningful ways in a virtual context? So obviously they've adapted as well. And so had a bunch of good thinking to bring to bear. So where we left it off is kind of what I emailed a bit about, which was to kind of do this most satisfactory to ensure we're not kind of just, that people get out of the experience what we hope for them and intend for them to do. Her recommendation from the experience, which really resonated, was to invite a small group of stakeholders into kind of a pre-meeting, not to have the conversation, but to kind of surface the issues we want to have when we have the broader conversation, so that when that happens, we maximize our opportunity for people walking away, getting what they kind of needed out of the engagement, right? As opposed to us kind of predetermining it without those kind of a smaller kind of core group of constituents kind of in the conversation to help kind of shape and frame what the broader conversation would be. So it's a little bit of kind of like thus the kind of recommendation was to have that smaller planning meeting in December. That was the date I floated. And then ideally to follow that up in January with a kind of bigger event. And she was imagining that in that structure could host a larger number of folks again, so we can be a bit more expansive about kind of invite at that time to think, she was even talking numbers 40 to 50. We don't have to go that big, and I don't think we need to make that decision right now either. But she was comfortable thinking about that. And there were a couple other potential facilitators she might bring into that to help do breakouts or small groups if the group is of that size. But the next step that was kind of recommended was to have that smaller kind of planning meeting. So my hope tonight was to do kind of two things: confirm that date. I know I heard from both Emily and Roberto about the proposed date kind of working. So I think want to kind of confirm that, look ahead to January a little bit now to think about putting on the calendar what might be the larger kind of, bigger event, right? The actual kind of meeting, so that we just kind of block that off now, and I can go back and forth with Michelle to make sure that works for her. So calendaring was kind of one goal of this conversation, and then starting to generate, and that was why I kept, put Sarah on the invite, and, we can follow up with Sarah as well, about who's, if we're thinking 8 to 10, maybe 12, but who are those 8 to 10, 12 folks we kind of want to meet with Michelle to help frame up the broader conversation that we want to have. So starting to potentially identify some of those individuals, even by name, of who we think might be the right people to invite to that first kind of pre-conversation. So that was the second objective of this check-in. Does that make sense?
Sounds good.
Any questions before we kind of start ticking those off, calendaring and then invite? No,
it sounds really good to me.
You mentioned sort of a 40 or 50 person, that would be like sort of the main event. Are we thinking that being just an open invitation or are we thinking, that would be sort of capped at that level, or that that number of people would be invited? I'm just curious about what the structure of that.
I think was, leaning away from it being just like some big open event, that anybody, but we're beyond that, people, being able to include additional stakeholders from kind of those networks to get to, that's, again, we don't have to fill that number, right? But she was just, I say that just because that was bigger than I was imagining, being able to like facilitate meaningfully virtually. So I think that's the upper end. But I think in terms of the kind of dialogue and, that we'd have, that this is, that we would be kind of inviting a broader kind of group of folks to that event. So does that answer?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
And I'm just asking Sarah now via text if she can do it.
Okay. Mm-hmm. So the working date, was the December 9th. That's going to make for a busy week that week, just because we have inauguration board meeting in this. So this is, again, a smaller kind of planning meeting, but, anyway, felt like of the cadence of things in December, that it was kind of she couldn't do the 16th. That was the other date, I was putting out there. So anyway, because by the 23rd, obviously feels a little late, could consider a Thursday or something like that as well. But anyway, knew that Wednesdays was generally available, no other committee meetings or, BFOF meetings and things like that, DLAP or DBAC often are Thursday afternoons. So that was why I landed on that. So if that generally works, we'll wait to hear from Sarah for kind of final. Let's look ahead to January to think about what might be a couple proposed dates I could bring back to Michelle to think about for kind of the main event. Yes. So does our board meeting, Tuesdays generally don't work for her, so that's fine, in terms of that, but
And we're talking about 6 p.m.
Yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, we could flex that a little bit if, you know.
Okay. Sarah's going to look when she gets home. January. I mean, I think looking at Mondays and Wednesdays in January. So Sarah, I mean, as I would expect, Sarah is just saying probably not, it probably won't work for her because of the board meeting inauguration that Monday and Tuesday. It is a lot back to back.
Totally.
I wonder if, like one option, just looking at Mondays in addition to Wednesdays. So if we looked at Monday the 14th.
That works, you know. And I don't know if Thursday the 17th, I don't see anything.
That would be a DABC meeting because it's the third Thursday.
Is it? Okay, I see the finance committee on the 10th. I just didn't have a.
It might, the other, the 14th or 21st look like maybe I don't know if is the 21st too late?
No, I think it maybe pushes back, like if we're thinking about it in January. No, I think it's just getting it in by the holiday break. So we're positioned for, kind of the January event. I mean, I think, when we're talking for January, again, I don't know if Wednesdays are, like Wednesday, January 20th might be a good moment to have, come out of the new year, have a little bit of time to make sure, we're able to get the word out and get folks there, but potentially ahead of what might be our committee meeting. I know we need to set calendars once the committee gets kind of reorganized, but if we stay in the fourth Tuesday kind of zone, that would mean we would get it in before the policy committee meeting, which might be nice. But, again, I think we've prioritized doing it well over rushing it. So.
And so that was can you repeat the January dates again?
I was looking at January. I think the only one I think I said was Wednesday, January 20th, potentially.
Okay.
It'd be good to identify like two potential ones just in case I need to run this by the facilitator, Michelle. So that could be one. That week is MLK week, so that Monday would not work.
How about Monday the 25th is an alternative, just so that we realistically have time to prepare for it.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody see any conflicts with either of those options? And then for December, we're now kind of looking at December 14th or 21st.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll shoot Michelle an email tonight to try and nail those down so we can.
Great.
Okay, and then at least now for the December meeting, right? I think we just want to focus on December meeting right first of who do we given kind of how, you guys have talked about it, or, Emily, I'm thinking of you and Sarah, right? Some of the conversation we had a month or so ago, who do we think makes sense to kind of invite into that conversation? Roberto?
Can you again just say a little bit about what we want to accomplish in that meeting? I think you mentioned it was more. Yeah, can you just touch on that again?
I mean, I guess I would describe it as a bit of a planning meeting. So it's not like fully talking about all the issues, but helping to surface about what do we want to talk about with the larger group in the January meeting, and inviting some key kind of representatives, for a lack of a better word. I mean, I don't think they're necessarily positioned as such, right? But kind of key stakeholders, right? Into that, so that they're helping to kind of frame up, so we're not missing something, right, that somebody would want to kind of get out of the conversation. So we're able to surface what are the issues we need to talk about in that larger group meeting. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And you may have said this, and I apologize if that's the case, because then it's super obvious, but this is around law enforcement policies. So
the chief obviously is like, somebody that comes to mind. Are you thinking that level of people, or?
I mean, I was thinking like it might be folks, like one or two of the PHS students that was organizing the petition, right? That they represented kind of a group of folks. I wondered if I wasn't sure kind of how to weed through from parent folks. I didn't know if if they're so. I mean, I think there's kind of like of stakeholder groups. Is there a student or two, right? A parent or two that maybe represents, that kind of stood out, that and again, I think thinking of Sarah's words back in, or the framing discussion we had a while ago, somebody who's not extreme in their view, I guess, around it, but is going to approach it, with some understanding. So are there a couple parents? I was thinking about potentially, a staff person or two from one of the high schools that had spoken, so kind of that.
Like Olivia Bean.
Yeah, potentially Olivia. Yeah, I mean, I think, we may want to think about the PHS crew and, kind of engage the PHS leadership about who might be a good representative, somebody good to invite into that conversation. Could be Olivia. Folks.
Sorry. I think, like, thinking of groups, I think that you just came up with a couple of ones that make sense, right? So I think a student group from the high schools makes sense, and then have them figure out a process to select, maybe, or to figure out a process to select who might be doing that. And the same thing if staff members, like you said, tapping into the teams there and letting them know what the work is, and maybe they can figure out. It seems like a short turnaround time, but maybe they can figure out a selection process, and there'll be volunteers, or who knows. But the high schools, I think are obviously immediately some groups that we need to include. Yeah,
and I don't imagine it being super formal in terms of a selection process, but engaging, and then talking with, particularly the PHS leadership about, our building towards having this conversation and that kind of stuff. So,
and let's make sure it's people who are, pretty significantly involved, because part of what we're trying to do is repair harm on, and come to build consensus about, or rebuild some trust, right? Mm-hmm. So I'd want to make sure that it's some of the core folks who are involved.
That was from like a perspective, just to kind of like level set. I mean, you started with kind of the chief. My sense is like, we're in this kind of conversation that doesn't feel like the right kind of constituent group kind of that we're pulling in this conversation, we might invite them, into the larger conversation. And that might be the place where we have as well then, Danielle from Cutler Institute, and some of those folks more represented in the larger group. But for this, I mean, obviously they were impacted, but I think obviously in a different way than kind of like members of our PPS community directly. So just to name that, but, to offer that up to see if we're on the same page with that.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, because again, if what we're aiming to do here is to sort of kind of just set the table, so to speak, like figure out what exactly we're going to talk, then I think the chief and even Danielle or Michael Cabete from ACLU, those people are more of I guess you would start to get more into the content area part of it, and not necessarily what we're doing here, which is more process, figuring out the process. Yeah, so I think that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Well, I can facilitate some, from this side with kind of, potential staff and students. I guess, if there were particular, parents or folks, kind of constituents that you guys were connected to, and that Sarah was connected to, if there are specific recommendations, would love to, be able to follow up on those. So whether, can I have them now, or, that's a question back to Sarah. And I can reach out to Sarah as well, or if you're in dialogue with her about it, either way.
Maybe what we could plan to do is to just over the course of this week, or like week going into like actual week, so through early next week, send you some suggestions. I can reach out to some of the other board members and just make sure that we're that we're thinking about some of the students, staff, and parents that were most engaged. Again, this would be a small group, but I think some of those, Sarah and I think others might have recommendations.
Great. Okay. Yeah. If we could, if like by Wednesday, we had some folks kind of targeted, just so that give them, roughly a week and a half or something, and we'll probably need to shoot bigger than, 10 to 12, just, because it might not work for some people and blah, 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 to be able to get the right group and balance together around the issue.
I was wondering if like the Family Partnership Advisory Group or Portland Empowered could be groups that might be good to ask for representatives, or from parent groups in particular.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, we'll engage with those. Yeah, there's some kind of, whether it's Family Partnership Advisory, Portland Empowered, we'll put heads together with Grace as well. And kind of come up with a potential roster. And if there are specific recommendations, you guys can forward those to me, and kind of then I'll reflect back kind of how it's evolving in terms of kind of the invite list for the meeting.
Great. Thank you so much. It's good, really good progress on this.
Yeah. It feels like timing wise, it's all kind of coming together here a little bit. So, all right. So that was the first agenda item for today. Was just kind of continuing to move that forward. So next agenda item is us kind of going through the next 3 discipline policies. So again, just to kind of set it in context, and then invite Jake, and I'll update screen sharing here, that kind of our trajectory that we've been working towards is we kind of have done a first pass at revisions. So Jake has been working from the CEE review, the Center for Educational Equity. Their feedback on the policies incorporated 1 level of draft. We've engaged with the Family Partnership Advisory Council for an additional round of feedback. He's incorporated some of that feedback as well. So what you'll see tonight, as you did last time, kind of incorporates those first 2 rounds of potential feedback, and addresses, by and large, some of the gender neutral pronouns and things like that should, have cleaned up some of those things. So tonight, as we did last time, kind of this is a discussion about, feedback and potential revisions, not a, we're not going to vote on these to kind of move them forward tonight, because we were wanting to have both the conversation we were just talking about, as well as the advancement of the equity policy work to kind of happen before we then came back, which will be with the kind of new reconstituted committee, but to then kind of review them essentially, not that this is our typical practice, but in this case, given the engagement, kind of like a second read for the policy committee is kind of like a final read in which we'd then be voting to kind of move them forward to the board. So that'll be one of the immediate charges when the new committee kind of gets configured and so forth. So tonight's just kind of a discussion again, what, particularly given the conversations we've been having through the board retreat, how is this aligning with, the direction we want to take and kind of how we want to codify our approach to student discipline with an equity perspective. So that's that. So again, many appreciations to Jake for his leadership with this work for us and kind of bringing the expertise he holds around it. So we'll do the same kind of thing. Jake will kind of walk us through a bit of the revisions where we stand, and then open it up for some discussion and feedback that we can capture and incorporate into kind of version 2.0 or 3.0, whatever we're at this point. That sound good?
Sounds good. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody, for your back-to-back evenings of service. And the comments you gave last time were super useful and have been incorporated. Look forward to your thoughts tonight. So like Aaron said, we're looking at the remaining 3 policies of the bundle. Technically 4. I'm proposing eliminating a 4th policy, so I'll get to that. There's no great way to do this on Zoom, but I think the screen share is probably the best bet. I took the liberty of cleaning up track changes on these so that you only have to look at kind of the substantive changes. So changing to gender neutral pronouns, fixing grammar, moving the order of things, fixing grammatical issues. You're not going to see that markup. All you're going to see is the items that I think are substantive and worthy of your attention. So starting, and I realize that I tend to move really fast, and I'm going to try to get you out on time. So if you need me to slow down or pause on something, just jump in. The first policy we're going to look at is JIC, which is the System-Wide Student Code of Conduct. It's kind of an umbrella preamble policy for all of the policies related to behavior management and discipline. And it used to be really long. It had like a summary of every other policy in it. So the substantive changes that I have here are some items to match this committee's preferences around tone, and the elimination of all those summaries of other policies. Okay. So
That's
the first
an accomplishment. Sorry, Jake, but
say that again.
That's an amazing accomplishment alone. This is a transformed policy.
It's the Paperwork Reduction Act of 2020, right? Okay, so throughout these policies, you'll see, in keeping with the revisions for the other 4 policies, some tonal changes about orderly and respectful learning environment, trimming that down to safe learning environment. I think there was some feelings among the different input bodies about law and order vocabulary. I wanted to note Article 2 that references the statewide standards for ethical and responsible behavior. I had not heard of them, so I looked them up. They are indeed statewide standards that were established in 2001. Yellow Light Breen and others, if you remember him. I didn't see any preemptory language that said they've been supplanted, so I assume our policies should be consistent with them, but I don't see any mandate that we reference them explicitly. So you could trim that out if you wanted. I'm going to scroll up to Article 3. Chris Reiger and some of the other input bodies helped me revise this language a little bit for tone, to remove references to grooming that could have racial under and overtones, and also to add some language in the preamble of the article that's consistent with PBIS, positive behavioral supports and interventions. That expectations are really explained and taught and continuously reinforced in a positive way with students, rather than just being a list of things that we're going to catch them doing wrong and punish them for. There are some other minor edits, insertions suggested by CEE there.
I have some thoughts on this one. Can I?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Jake, this policy overall is just, it's like, it's already such a huge improvement in that it doesn't summarize all the other policies, which I always found very confusing or just hard to digest. And we will get to it, I know, but I really loved some of the affirmative language that was in the bullying and cyberbullying policy, the revision. So just the first sentence, it says Portland Public Schools affirms our intention to create a climate of respect, inclusion, and equity for all. I wonder if a statement like that would also be appropriate for the beginning of this this policy. It feels more like what we're trying to achieve than some of the words even in the revised code of conduct, specifically with respect to talking about inclusion and equity for all.
Yep.
So that was one thought. And then when I read this, I appreciate how much this has changed, but I'm still not sure this is actually what some of what we're after. Like, I'll be specific. In Article 3, I think we should not use the word obey. I don't think we're teaching kids to obey in any way. So perhaps it's just I'm just reacting to that word, but I don't think that's I think we should figure out different words to use. And then just the fact that number 1 is be courteous to fellow students, staff, and visitors. I certainly appreciate being courteous, but I would not lead with that. That's not, what I think we are first and foremost trying to achieve in our schools, or trying to lay out and positively reinforce. And I felt like, honestly, when I read that, I felt like it was a little bit like artifact of like very white supremacist kind of, ways of what we view as appropriate behavior. So sorry if my reading of that is harsh, but I'm fine with keeping it. But can we move it? Can we move it like to number 11? And so I don't know. I think I wonder if we take like another look at, are these really the right 11 things? And then maybe reordering them so that they're maybe more, I'm not sure this is necessary, but that one just jumped out at me as like, why are we leading with that? So there is perhaps something about the order. If a student is reading through this and the first thing we're telling them is to be courteous. Again, I really appreciate, being courteous, but just not the thing that really jumps out at me of what we're trying to achieve in terms of, or what we really want to hold up and value in student behavior.
Mm-hmm.
Those were my kind of top line thoughts on this.
Yeah. barring any contradictory guidance from the committee, I can certainly make adjustments along those lines. And just since we didn't hit it, Article 4 used to be the summary, so it just basically dumps all the summaries down to cross-references. So that's JIC. Any comments from other attendees?
I think, just again with the list of behavior expectations, follow directions from school staff seems. I don't know. I wonder if like the word reasonable or something like that. Like I think there are probably times when a student could rightly question the direction that they're being given, and this is very you will follow the direction that you're given, without questioning it. I just wonder if there's some sort of modifier that we can use there.
And I would imagine there's fair latitude from like the, what's required context given the language that precedes it, which is like, these are general examples of the expectations the board considers fundamental. So, a fair amount of latitude in that regard. And I think what both your comments are coming up for me thinking about kind of our discussion around restorative practices last night, which is like in service of trying to foster shared ownership over community, how might that influence this language? Because certainly, it's advanced from where it was in terms of like kind of historical, feels like 1980s or 90s, kind of like school rules, but still has a little bit of flavor of that and what might be a re-articulation of that would be kind of broad scope within that. The other thing I was going to just say, because it does feel random, and I should have said at the beginning, we've connected with our Drummond consultants, so they know that we're going to share kind of Jake's incorporation of these revisions from both the last set and this set with them during December, so that when we come back in January, we'll have their take on, just the Drummond perspective when we look at it. And they get where we're trying to go with it. So we had a kind of pre-meeting about it. But one of the questions specifically about this one, we'll ask about the Article 2 piece, like those random state, things. I mean, not that those are bad things that we don't aspire to, but it gets confusing. I mean, we've narrowed it down significantly, but potentially could be even more clear of like broad statements of overall kind of behavior expectations as opposed to two different lists of behavior expectations, right?
Great. And it strikes me that less maybe is more in terms of articulating behavioral expectations at the board level, given that buildings are going through their own stakeholder processes to articulate them. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think
I'm sorry.
Right. Go ahead, Superintendent.
Erin is going to laugh at this, but we do have defined core values that are part of our Portland Promise, and we in my cabinet make fun of these all the time because they sort of happened in a way that that they don't really have a huge amount of buy-in from others. But I wonder if those might be a better set of sort of principles to sort of outline here. So high expectations, creativity and innovation, individuality, community, and courage. So just a thought.
So yeah. Mm-hmm.
It seems more, I mean, I hear you just said there's not a lot of buy-in, but it seems more authentic than this list here, which feels...
I mean, they came from a public process during the the Portland Promise work, where we brought, parents together, we brought students together, and, our communications consultants came up with those core values as a distillation of what people said, stood out about the Portland Public Schools. So from the, I think there's no buy-in for them because we've never done anything with them, and then when we sit and look at them, it's like, what does individuality really mean and all of that kind of stuff. But, we've also said, like, there's no point in trying to go and, change them because people, have seen these come and go, and we don't really want to spend our time on that. So I think that's the context in which I'm offering those up. I certainly think that they're more sort of us than, the 2001 version of the statewide standards of ethical and responsible behavior.
And just following from Erin's comment about our conversation last night about restorative practices, it does feel like so many of these are controlling, right? Which, we're like seeking to control students' behavior rather than building trust and community with them. So I think to the extent that we can move more in that direction, it would feel more consistent with what we're trying to do. I also just noting that in these 11, there's really nothing about equity, which feels like it's missing.
I mean, number 2 is probably more of what you would want to lead with, which I don't necessarily think that in that current, I don't like the use of privileges there, but, respecting the rights of everyone in the school community is probably the right tone for starting this. So I would definitely move that one up and, use that. Because it is about creating community.
Can I, Jake, when you were talking about Article 2 on the conversation with Chris Reiger, with Dr. Reiger, you mentioned that part of the thought process was understanding that, it's like an ongoing, it's an ongoing process, that you don't have like these really set expectations. So I'm wondering if as Emily kind of pointed out in Article 2, and as we kind of seem to be leading into in Article 2, the same sort of kind of applies, like being that those are, established standards from 2001 and they're listed there, there's not a lot of room like for flexibility, I guess, in the way that they're expected to be carried over, versus these that Javier is bringing up seem to not have any foundation. So we have room to, I'm saying that half jokingly, but we have room to kind of have flexibility with them, which I don't know if flexibility is the right word. I'm trying very poorly to capture what you meant was the input from Dr. Reiger and the discussion of Article 3 and applying it to Article 2.
Thanks.
I wonder if there's room in this policy, or if it would be appropriate to sort of introduce an idea of mutuality, of like, things like respect, that not only should students, be expected to be respectful, but should expect to be respected by staff and other students alike. And that just like sort of thinking about it more as like a community building where, everybody in the community is involved in creating that environment.
Yeah, you're speaking my language. At Lyman Moore, we just concluded a couple weeks ago a long stakeholder process of redefining our core behavioral expectations as applying to both students and adults. So I think I could probably bring some of that learning into this in the other docs. Okay, at the risk of rushing you, I'm going to move us to JICIA, Weapons, Violence, and School Safety. This is a chat item. Oh, thank you, Aaron. Okay, so again here, this should be viewed, kind of as something that might have originated post-Columbine and that we're looking at many years later. Okay. I want to flag here.
Point out that this one is one of the law enforcement policies as well.
Yeah. I cut language about other disruptive behavior because it seemed gratuitous. CEE suggested a confidential reporting option. I know we're going to get to that with the harassment policy. Because as far as I can tell, one of the main things that has come up in Portland in my time related to this policy has to do with air guns. They explicitly named them in 1A. Here I've deleted some references to behaviors that don't seem relevant to the policy and are covered under other policies. When we get to Article 3, there's something a little bit more important, and Chris Reiger helped me with this. The district has recently adopted the Virginia Threat Assessment Protocol. I think it's called by a new name now. But it's a response against zero tolerance disciplinary responses to weapons and threats. And so I've just referenced in kind of high-level language what that policy entails. The administrators have been trained in and are to use this threat assessment protocol, which helps administrators distinguish in a defensible way between transient or non-serious threats and those that are serious and need action. And it also guides a response action that's not simply punitive, that is oriented around mental health and safety planning. The other two comments on the side there are deletions of language that really it suggests non-mandatory and mandatory sentences, basically. These suggested deletions say they imply kind of a minimum sentence for some of these behaviors and then qualify that by saying that they don't need to be applied necessarily. And it just seemed like a little outdated to be alluding to minimum sentences. I'm using that language a little flippantly. I also deleted some language authorizing Javier to train staff and students. I don't know why he would need the authorization to do that. So this is a low incidence policy. I didn't work it over too hard, but I'd be happy to hear your comments now on this policy, JICIA.
I believe there is some state law that looking at the one at the top of the screen around expulsion in case of firearms possession. What are our obligations, and how does this policy meet or meet those or not?
I can't answer that, but I can find out.
I think this language reflects what is the law around that.
Javier, the new Jake's proposed language or the deleted language?
I don't know, because I was not looking at that. I'm looking at it now.
This deletion that I've highlighted looks like the statutory language.
That is the statutory language. Yeah. Yeah. But what you kept is that with applicable state and federal laws, right?
Yeah. So yeah, the revised language doesn't preclude anything ultimately. I mean, this was your point of kind of like it asserts an expectation of expulsion, but then qualifies that to say, except you can change that, because it could be modified on a case-by-case basis. So,
can I say on that second paragraph, where we say disciplinary responses could include suspension and or expulsion based upon, is there a reason that those two options have to be singled out? Because it could also include other outcomes, like really, broad, restorative practice that results in restorative justice. So I don't know if that, or this is specific, like, is that always going to be an outcome, suspension and expulsion?
Yeah, I think we could, it strikes me that it's important to at least name that that's a possible response
I think that
on the spectrum.
Yeah, I hear you about, saying that there could be other consequences, but I do think that saying that is a potential consequence of it is important.
I can elaborate that language.
I had a question higher up in the policy where we talk about theft, and I'm wondering if theft is covered under other board policies.
It is. That was a CEE suggestion, but I'm not sure why it's important to put it there.
I guess I was wondering, not just the addition, I'm just wondering the inclusion of personal property in here in a policy around weapons and violence. I was just wondering if we also address this elsewhere, and if so, if we need it in both places.
I think that's a good point.
And if we don't include property, it's also referenced in H.
And E also gets into overlapping with other policies.
I don't think that there is another policy where theft is mentioned.
Okay.
So, I think that falls broadly under the school safety label of this policy. It's weapons, but it's also violence and school safety.
Okay. I'm conscious of your time. Any last suggestions on this policy before I hit JICK, which is a little more substantive?
I wonder if up in the preamble we want to sort of express a preference for a restorative approach whenever possible, just to sort of say that up front, that we whenever that's seems like a reasonable alternative, that would be the approach that we would prefer to see followed.
That's great.
I think that that's consistent with what Emily said about the other policies. I wonder if we could come up with a strong affirmative statement that could go with all of these policies at the outset as a way of affirming that.
And part of where the language Jake was referencing that we'll look at bullying was also borrowed from, was looking at the harassment policy and some of the language that was the framing there. So ultimately, there being some consistency in tone and message across this suite of policies in terms of they're all in service of creating, equitable and safe learning environments for students.
Oh, that's interesting. That strikes me that we could do equitable and safe as a motif rather than orderly and respectful.
I just want to acknowledge that I've never had a student discipline issue that involved a crossbow. The numerous list of weapons is quite a...
But that's because you were in California. In Maine, we were
that is probably standard language for Maine policy.
I know in Indiana it was a thing, so I can only imagine.
All right, I guess, yeah.
Okay, I've moved us by fiat here to JICK, bullying and cyberbullying. I will, in keeping with comments on the other two policies, I will go back and make sure the preamble language is consistent and affirmative and restorative oriented across the policies. Most of what I've done on this first screen here is import language from ACAA, assuming that came from a good process and reflect the current beliefs of the board and school district.
Jake, do you want to go through the whole thing first, or jump in with?
Maybe let's do that because, yeah, let's do that real quick. Here I've referenced appropriate noticing that's consistent with PBIS and equitable communication. Behaviors. I restructured the policy so that it matches the structure of ACAA. So Article 2 is definitions. There are three terms defined here: bullying, cyberbullying, and retaliation. Throughout the policy, those are kind of the three behaviors that are covered. I wanted to highlight here that in the definition of bullying, I've taken the liberty, and this is consistent with a state working group that.
Is everybody else there?
Yeah.
Okay. He was referring to, we had, on this one, Robin Bailey, the assistant principal at Lincoln, had been involved with a state working group on bullying over the past year. So, the three of us met to kind of talk about this policy and kind of what the takeaways were from that group and how that kind of squared with where our policy stood. And in general, felt like we had done, this policy, I think is, some of you may be more familiar with that, was revised more recently than some of the other discipline policies because of state legislation around, as I understand, around the cyberbullying and inclusion of that. So this one has, at the outset, had a little bit more kind of consistent language and so forth than in tone and approach to how we kind of did some of our other revisions. So, and that, her takeaway was our policy was in pretty good shape. Welcome back, Jake. Was just summarizing a little bit of our conversation with Robin. And you're muted, Jake. Looks like you froze again. So maybe I'll try and do my best here with some of these pieces. In terms of the definitions, one of the pieces that I think has been one of the most significant sticking points in trying to figure out how to implement our existing policy around bullying has been the often very difficult judgment calls of like what's just some inappropriate inappropriate conduct, and when does that spill over into bullying, right? Does calling somebody a name constitute bullying, or at what point does it rise to that threshold? So that just in implementation has been one of the greatest challenges for school leaders around just kind of implementing bullying. So one of the things that came out of Robin and Jake and I's conversation was that last piece of the definition of bullying around repeated behaviors, that really is part of what distinguishes it from, just kind of an isolated incident that may also still warrant being addressed and so forth. It's not like those things don't get addressed, but whether it rises to the threshold to constitute bullying. So that's one specific kind of change that, kind of asserting here. I think moving down, again, most of that was restructuring for the definitions of cyberbullying and retaliation, the application of policy. I think those were coming out of recommendations from CE. And then kind of reporting process and documentation. So this is where it gets to, we've been exploring the one that he was referencing around elimination. It's not a policy. It's the form that was part of the package. I think the JICK E2, it was like the form that was had been adopted that administrators needed to complete and submit in hard copy. And we've found in practice, again, that we believe that to be a barrier to quality reporting. So we've been, moving towards the direction of utilizing our Infinite Campus, our student information system, and the discipline records within that to be that, because then that captures all the demographic data that we're required to report. We have different state and federal reporting requirements around bullying. So trying to align with that. So Jake's done some work with our director of data, Jamie Kearney, about like what are the right fields. And so we're working towards configuration on that part so that we're not asking folks to kind of double entry for every time, because like the reality was, and part of our challenge was like, wait, every time somebody gets called a name on the playground, right, is that bullying? Do I need to complete and submit the form, right? And that led to a lot of non-submission and kind of inaccurate data, I would say. So we're trying to, our approach here around this is to try and streamline that so that we can have more effective data around bullying and be just more responsive, obviously, in the end. But at a system level to have greater insight into where bullying, because right now, if you looked at it, and I think we've raised this, like from our reporting, we had like one instance of bullying in the past 2 years or something like that, versus what students report in the Maine Integrated Youth Health Survey, where they're, significantly more frequency, they're reporting having experienced bullying at our schools. So we recognize there's this gap in trying to clean up our expectations here to have it align, or to facilitate better reporting and have it align somewhat to our expectations around documenting investigations through the harassment discrimination policy. So there's not 5 different ways you need to document things, but it's a little bit more just consistent of like, when you have a substantive thing, this is how we document it, whether it's harassment, bullying, or whatever. So Jake, I kind of took them through a little bit And just to see if there's anything else you want to call out. I called out the addition of the like repeated, behavior in the bullying definition as one significant kind of add here in terms of the defining of bullying and why that's been an issue. Beyond that, I didn't dig super deep into some of the other language revisions. I thought they were mostly CE driven, but just overall kind of the, you heard my end of that piece about documentation and reporting and kind of what the implication is for the form that previously had been adopted. So anything else you want to add to these?
Just basically with the documentation requirement that is statutory for that buildings maintain some kind of documentation of allegations and investigations and report substantiated allegations and responses. And our current practice of recording those in Infinite Campus suffices to meet the state requirement for substantiated allegations. And I'm proposing that we have a building specific or just non-board policy level documentation practices for documenting unsubstantiated allegations. So I think you've hit all the big things. I know, Emily, you already had some comments to share.
Yes, thanks so much.
Yeah.
Couple things that jumped out at me. One in the, paragraph 2, some of the new language that was that follows on the work we did or on the discrimination, harassment, and sexual harassment policy. I think the language here should be PPS will use age-appropriate preventive and responsive strategies that empower victims of bullying and cyber.
Yeah.
And then a little bit below it says de-escalation of bias-related incidents, and I think it should be bullying-related.
Thank you.
And I was happy to see the cross-reference in the definitions. And the other thing, jumping ahead, but the other thing that that jumped out at me was under 6, assignment of responsibility. I don't think the school board's responsibility. I think we should probably. I don't think those are typically school board responsibilities now.
Right.
Okay.
So those were my initial thoughts.
Gotcha.
One thought I had as we were discussing the reporting requirements at the state and federal level is should the board have some sort of report on bullying at some interval, and I don't know. It just seems curious that the state and federal government seem awfully curious and want to have their finger to the pulse on this stuff, and it doesn't seem like I don't know. I think the board would find it interesting if we've had one reported case over the course of 2 years and wonder are we actually doing enough to document and keep close to this stuff. So
in practice, that could align with what we articulated in the harassment discrimination policy in terms of that codified a commitment of kind of like an annual reporting of incidents. So language here could be consistent with that. And that's all just like one update, right? Is how I imagine that would play out in practice.
And we've also made a tentative commitment to equity-based suspension and detention, but equity-based discipline reporting to the board on an annual basis.
Can I ask a question? Just so I understand the state requirement, the reporting requirement, when there's an incident, is there there's I'm using the idea of a drop down menu, but there's there's different options for incidents to select, or is it more like a free text thing? Because I'm wondering then, when you mentioned before that you look back and you're like, oh, we see one incident of bullying, is that because bullying was just not an option selected, or was it just never captured as any incident at all? Or I'm just wondering what that process looks like, and if there's a way for the board to understand whether I'm wondering if even the way that the state categorizes incidents is outdated. I don't know if that's yeah. And to better understand, how we report that to the state, I guess is what I'm trying to get to, and we don't have to get to that right now.
Right. Just briefly, Roberto, it's when administrators or their supporting staff enter a major disciplinary incident into Infinite Campus, they can flag it as bullying. But was the state reporting, Aaron, that Jamie does, that she only entered one, is that because only one person submitted JICKE2, or because only one incident in Infinite Campus was labeled as bullying?
No, yeah. Prior to last year, where we kind of rolled out expectations to start to use Infinite Campus, and correct me if I'm wrong, Javier and Ann, I don't know if you've seen this in historical files, but the source data for state reporting was, I think, a spreadsheet that Janet held, because that form that got submitted to Janet, and she logged, I believe, in a spreadsheet that then was shared with Jamie, and any of the additional demographic data was added, and that's what was submitted then. So it happened outside of Infinite Campus, which again was part of our concern.
Yeah. Okay. So Roberto, Jamie, central office could pull it from Infinite Campus instead and get all of the necessary data for the state reporting. I have confirmed that with Jamie Kearney.
Javier, what were you going to say?
To me, that's a critical move that we need to make, because it was, completely, out of sync with the reality of our schools, that we were reporting, one case every 3 years. It was, all of the different layers of this. So I do think that that has to come out, and we need to move to making the report on and from Infinite Campus.
Yeah.
Are there any other thoughts on this policy? If not, we have one attendee, Liz Blackwell-Moore, who many of you will know, who's been engaged in these policies in a very, very in-depth way. And so, Liz, if I wanted to offer you an opportunity to provide feedback on any of these three policies, if you'd like.
Wow, thank you. Hi, everyone. I've just been listening in. Great. It's really, I don't really have anything right this second that I'd point to. The only thing I wondered about with the bullying policy is just, I was following along, but I didn't see any specific, and maybe it's because I haven't been a part of the bias and discrimination conversation. I didn't see that. I just didn't see anything specific about race or LGBT bullying necessarily. And maybe that's because I missed that other conversation, but didn't know if that belonged in here at all.
Oops, I think I put the wrong thing.
One, thanks, Liz. That one that sometimes is often then thus, when it's based on a protected category, that can mean that it falls under the harassment discrimination policy potentially. There's a bit of kind of a Venn diagram around that. Mm-hmm. But it is also called out under the definitions. Bullying includes, and then number 3 is based on a student's actual perceived race, color, national origin, ancestry, gender, sexual orientation, or other distinguishing characteristic. And it refers there to the harassment policy.
Oh, great. I'm sorry. I missed that part. Sorry.
Plenty here to take in. So.
And the only other thing I'd just reiterate is the thing about the code of conduct. I would just say too, I appreciated Emily's comments, and I think that Tim said them too, just that you have such an opportunity to put in this a tone, like starting from the top almost, of a little more robust about how we that it's a shared system, a shared sort of behavior is a shared community responsibility, and there are some examples from other places of that. And if there's an interest in that, I know sort of some other schools, San Francisco has some like shared language around how to really push this part around community. Because I think you all and like the schools I see doing work around trying to have teachers and students be seeing this as shared, but it doesn't come through in that policy very much. And you just have such a great moment to like do it. So anyway, I appreciate you even offering me to say anything. I'm so appreciative of you all doing this work. So thank you so much.
Liz, if you wanted to send me links to any of that model language, I'd love to see it.
Okay, I will.
Yeah.
But that is consistent, I think, with some of what we've talked about here today, which is the sort of set of, a universal tone to all of these policies that is, affirmative and, sort of consistent with our values. So
seems like the two kind of big umbrella ones as it relates to this is the JIC, Student Code of Conduct, and then the one we looked at last time, which is kind of the broader overarching student discipline policy, and ensuring kind of we hit the mark, in terms of kind of the, just as Liz named, kind of the aspiration, right, of kind of setting our approach there, that those two, kind of are the broadest umbrella to speak to in terms of communicating our approach around creating community and, managing towards that kind of collectively. So.
Can I ask one quick question? Javier, you noted at the beginning that, and I forgot which one it was, that if maybe it's more than one of them, it's also part of the law enforcement review. Anything else that we should note about that and the process that will be taken forward in how we're approaching these revisions?
Both JIC and JICIA are law enforcement related policies. So I do think that there should be like maybe just a second for us to talk through, since we are tackling all law enforcement policies in one, sort of process, how to even think about or talk about the fact that we are, sort of picking these two off ahead of that. They're not the ones, in my sort of in my mind that are more, sort of problematic. So the alcohol, alcohol one is one. Drug and alcohol use, the questioning and searches is a big one, and the educational records and visitors to the schools. Those are the ones that are most problematic in the way that they're constructed right now. These others are mainly, I am looking at that list, and JICK is also a part of that. So JIC, JICIA, and JICK, all three policies that we looked at today, are three of the 8 policies that we will be looking at. And just to be clear, sort of in JICK, and I've been sort of multitasking, so I haven't followed this conversation as close as I probably should have. But the mention to law enforcement in this one is in relation to making a referral if it rises to a criminal charges under the Maine Civil Rights Act.
Mm-hmm.
I just want to thank Liz for your engagement and good feedback. And Jake, if you're open to it, Liz sent me an email earlier this week or late last week with some good feedback as well as on the discipline policy. I'm wondering if I could email it to you.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for that, Liz.
Thank you.
Just looking at that that F, the Maine Civil Rights Act reference. It says the school principal or the superintendent's designee. I guess I would feel more comfortable if something like that was sort of only superintendent, and that was a little bit more tightly controlled. Sort of. I feel like the escalation of something to law enforcement should really be closely guarded.
There's lots of shaking heads in agreement. In agreement.
To limit it to a superintendent.
I mean, maybe or designee.
I would say superintendent or designee.
Okay.
And I mean, Aaron and I have talked a little bit about this just in general as a sort of a standard cleanup to our policies. We should have delegation be from the board to the superintendent, who's really the board's only employee, and then to allow the superintendent to delegate it to to everybody else that is technically their employee. So.
I wondered, I don't have the other one, the weapons policy, but I wonder if there's similar language shift there to look at, just to clarify that, just to try and address those now, right? So that, we'll come back to it when we have some of the deeper law enforcement conversation, but ideally we've already shifted these, and we'll have to get into exactly how we want to bring all these forward and what that process will look like. We don't need to deal with that tonight, but the next iteration of the committee, that'll be a major, because there's going to be a lot of policies on both sides and so forth. So, but
you got a lot of policies, I'll say that.
Great. Well, if there aren't any more comments about these for this evening, again, kind of this was, I've been calling it unofficially kind of like the policy committee's first read at these to incorporate this feedback. Next steps, Jake's do kind of a revision of these, incorporating these suggestions, some other examples, right, as relevant to kind of meet the aspirations that we've talked about. We'll run those by the, our policy consultant at Drummond, just to have that feedback, them understanding what our goals are around this in terms of approach, but just being able to kind of tee up for the policy committee moving forward if there's any decisions for you guys to make in places where it contradicts, state policy or legislation, or maybe is a consideration for the board, right? Which is often kind of how they frame their feedback. So that'll be one of the steps. We have a couple other stakeholder engagements, right, that'll kind of offer, aren't as line by line, though. I think we will look at it. It's, some of that level with the school administrator group, but a little bit will be more holistically speaking in terms of coming out of the student engagement and, as we set up for this community engagement. So those will be some of the kind of substance for when the policy committee reconvenes to kind of come back to this to make final decisions on these set of student discipline policies before advancing them to the board. So that's what we're looking at in terms of process of next steps.
Thanks for the excellent input, everybody.
Thank you for all of your work, Jake. This is these are improving so dramatically. So it's great to see.
Thanks.
Yeah.
All right. I think that's it for the night. Is there a motion to adjourn? I'll second. All in favor? Yay. We're adjourned. Thank you, Jake and Aaron. And we'll talk soon.